The early morning sun glinted off the glass walls of Denver International Airport as Emily Walker strolled through Concourse with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. At 34, she carried herself with grace, her blonde hair tucked beneath a worn black baseball cap. She wore a simple charcoal gray sweatshirt, light gray sweatpants, and well-loved white sneakers. A silver bracelet, her late grandmother's, dangled loosely on her wrist, the only hint of personal sentiment she carried on her. Most people passing her wouldn't give her a second glance. She looked like any other traveler trying to stay comfortable on a long-haul flight. There was no makeup, no designer bag, no flashy jewelry. Certainly no clue that she was married to David Walker, the tech billionaire who had recently acquired Summit Air, the very airline she was about to board. David had offered their private Gulfstream G650 for her trip to Boston, but Emily politely declined. Her parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary that weekend, and she wanted the experience of flying like a regular person. No champagne toasts at 40,000 feet, no pilots on standby just for her. It kept her grounded, reminded her of who she was before life changed overnight. She stopped at a small cafe near Gate A22 and ordered a plain black coffee, no sugar, no cream. "Just like my dad drinks it," she told the young barista with a smile, reaching into her pocket to pay with cash instead of pulling out the titanium credit card linked to one of David's accounts. The barista gave her a curious glance. "Boston, huh?" he asked, reading the gate number on her boarding pass. "Nice place this time of year." "Family celebration," she replied warmly, dropping a few coins into the tip jar. Coffee in hand, she found a seat near the boarding gate and watched the steady rhythm of airport life unfold around her. Business travelers with Bluetooth earbuds paced nervously, glancing at their watches. Young families tried to corral toddlers while balancing diaper bags and snack packs. An older couple sat hand in hand, their fingers laced together like teenagers. When the gate agent's voice came over the intercom, "Now boarding our first-class passengers for Summit Air Flight 623 to Boston," Emily stood, picked up her soft leather backpack, and walked to the front of the line. She noticed a man in a sharp navy suit do a double take at her outfit. That used to rattle her. Now she barely blinked. The gate agent smiled, scanning her phone. The screen lit up with the name, Emily Walker, Seat 1A. The agent hesitated briefly, her eyes flickering from the screen to Emily's face, but quickly handed the phone back. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Walker." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice steady as she stepped onto the jet bridge. She had no idea that the next few minutes would change not just her day, but the future of an entire airline. The first-class cabin of Summit Air Flight 623 gleamed with quiet elegance, wide leather seats in deep navy, polished wood trim, and gentle lighting that gave the space a calm, upscale feel. As Emily Walker stepped inside, holding her boarding pass and coffee, the scent of citrus-scented sanitizer and fresh upholstery filled the air. A flight attendant in a crisp navy blue uniform, her name badge reading Rachel Moore, looked up from her tray of pre-departure mimosas. Her practiced smile faltered for just a moment. "Good morning," Emily said pleasantly. "Seat 1A, by the window." Rachel's eyes flicked over Emily's outfit, sweatpants, sweatshirt, old sneakers, and then to the digital boarding pass in her hand. "First class is to your left," she replied, the warmth in her voice noticeably cooler than it had been for the man in the Brooks Brothers suit who boarded just before Emily. Emily gave a small nod and headed toward her seat. She could feel Rachel's eyes lingering on her back, as though watching for a mistake. The first-class section was only half full, its passengers a mix of business executives and retirees. She recognized a television chef in Seat 1C. The woman didn't look up from her tablet. As Emily settled into 1A, Placing her backpack gently in the overhead bin, a second flight attendant approached. His name was Brian Thompson, and he carried himself with an air of silent authority. He looked down at Emily with a polite but skeptical smile. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again?" Emily blinked in surprise. "Of course." She pulled up the digital pass on her phone and held it out. Brian studied it for longer than necessary, his eyes shifting between the screen and her face. "One moment," he said, before walking back toward the galley. She watched as he and Rachel huddled near the curtain, whispering. Both glanced in her direction more than once. Emily knew this routine, not from experience, but from stories. Stories of people quietly sized up, subtly questioned, gently nudged back toward where others thought they belonged. Within minutes, a third figure entered the picture. Lisa Carter, the senior flight attendant with supervisor stripes on her shoulders, walked over. Her tone was cool and professional, but Emily heard the edge beneath it. "Ma'am, it appears there may be some confusion about your seat assignment." Emily put down her paperback. "There's no confusion. I'm in seat 1A. Lisa offered a tight smile. "Sometimes our system upgrades passengers by mistake." Emily met her gaze. "So you're saying I don't look like someone who buys a first-class ticket?" There was a beat of silence. Rachel and Brian shifted uncomfortably. Emily remained calm, her voice steady. She wasn't angry, yet, but she was no stranger to being underestimated. A businessman across the aisle peeked over his newspaper. His eyebrows lifted, curious. Emily looked at Lisa again. "Tell me, do you ask every first-class passenger to prove they belong here, or just the ones dressed like me?" For the first time, the cabin didn't feel so quiet. The tension had settled like turbulence that hadn't hit yet, but was coming. The hum of quiet conversation in the first-class cabin shifted into a hushed tension as Emily Walker sat in seat 1A, back straight, her book now resting on her lap. It was clear the three flight attendants, Rachel, Brian, and their supervisor, Lisa, were not letting the matter go. They had verified her boarding pass, not once but twice. Yet their unease didn't waver. "Ma'am," Lisa said again, standing beside her with arms folded, "we're going to need to verify your identification." Emily looked around. Not one other passenger had been asked for ID. Not the man across from her in sweatpants and loafers. Not the elderly couple in row 2. Only her. "I've already gone through TSA and the boarding gate," she replied calmly, reaching for her wallet. "Are you asking for ID because of a problem with my ticket, or because I don't look like someone who should be sitting here?" Lisa's expression tightened. "We're just following procedure." "Whose procedure?" Emily pressed gently. "Because I fly often, and this has never happened before." Brian stepped forward, arms crossed. "If you're unwilling to comply, we'll need to reassign you to another seat." Emily let out a slow breath. "I'm not unwilling. I'm just tired of being treated differently because I'm not wearing pearls and high heels." Now, the passengers nearby were openly watching. A woman in a designer scarf whispered to her husband. The businessman across the aisle frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Lisa's voice became clipped. "If you cannot produce identification immediately, we'll need to move you to a seat in economy so boarding can continue." Emily knew she had options. She could call David. She could mention her last name and watch the three of them scramble to apologize. But she didn't want to wield her husband's power like a weapon. That wasn't her way. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Fine. I'll move. But I want the full names and employee numbers of all three of you." Brian raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised she didn't argue further. We can give you that, yes. And we'll arrange a refund for the difference in fare. I'm not interested in money, Emily replied firmly, slipping her book into her backpack. I'm interested in accountability. The walk from first class to coach felt longer than it should have. Whispers followed her down the narrow aisle as Rachel guided her to row 22, CE, a cramped middle seat between two strangers. A flight attendant had already adjusted the armrests, as if to prove the move was permanent. This is your new seat, Rachel said, not quite meeting Emily's eyes. Emily nodded, her voice low but unwavering. You'll regret this decision. Maybe not today, but very soon. She slid into the seat and buckled in, her shoulders square, her pride intact. Around her, passengers avoided eye contact. Only one, a man with kind eyes and a weathered ball cap, gave her a knowing glance. Emily simply looked out the window, the Colorado mountains fading in the distance. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the sleek glass headquarters of Summit Air reflected the golden light of the Denver sunrise. Located just 15 miles from the airport, the building stood as a symbol of prestige and modern innovation, an architectural monument to the airline's ambition to lead the industry in premium service. Inside the top-floor conference room, Susan Blake, Vice President of Customer Experience, sipped her lukewarm coffee and stared at the agenda in front of her with a growing knot in her stomach. It was time for the quarterly customer satisfaction review, and the numbers weren't pretty. Complaints were up nearly 11%. A worrying chunk of them, too many, if she were honest, concerned staff behavior, especially on long-haul first-class flights. Her assistant poked her head in. The board is assembling now. And Mr. Walker, he's attending in person. Susan nearly dropped her coffee. David Walker, Summit's new owner and a titan of the tech world, rarely showed up for internal meetings. Since acquiring the airline just 9 months earlier, he had maintained a mostly hands-off role. His appearance today wasn't just unusual, it was telling. She stood up straight and smoothed her blazer. Make sure the first-class cabin crew from yesterday's Denver-Boston flight are here. Lisa Carter, Rachel Moore, and Brian Thompson. They've had solid performance metrics. I want to highlight them as positive examples. Meanwhile, across town in a quiet penthouse apartment, David Walker adjusted the cuffs of his navy blue suit. He wasn't one for flash, but his presence always carried weight. Behind him, Emily stood at the window, still in her favorite gray sweatshirt and sweatpants, sipping tea. I could make a call, David said softly, watching her reflection in the glass. One call, and they'd be out of jobs. Emily turned. This isn't about revenge, David. It's about culture. This kind of bias doesn't end with one firing. It ends when people see it for what it is and are forced to change. David studied her. There was something deeply admirable about the way she carried herself, never trading dignity for status. He nodded. All right. We'll do it your way. Back at Summit headquarters, the conference room was nearly full. Department heads, board members, and senior flight crew took their seats. Lisa, Rachel, and Brian sat near the back, chatting quietly among themselves. They assumed they were being recognized for good service. I think they're finally rolling out that elite service program, Rachel whispered. This could be our chance. At the head of the table, Susan Blake cleared her throat. Thank you all for being here. Customer experience is at the heart of Summit Air's brand. Today we'll review key metrics and highlight areas of success and opportunity. Just as she advanced to the first slide, the doors opened. David Walker entered with calm authority. Every head turned. He gave a polite nod but didn't speak. He simply took his seat at the head of the table. Whatever this meeting had been, it was about to change. The conference room buzzed with the quiet hum of anticipation as Susan Blake clicked through her slides, detailing quarterly trends in customer satisfaction. Most of the room was only half listening, eyes occasionally darting toward David Walker, seated at the head of the table. The billionaire was known for being calm, calculated, and rarely present unless something big was brewing. And our first-class transcontinental routes continue to rank highest in passenger satisfaction, Susan continued, her voice gaining confidence. In fact, I'd like to highlight the crew from yesterday's Denver to Boston flight, Lisa Carter, Rachel Moore, and Brian Thompson, whose performance metrics are consistently in the top 5%. The three crew members sat up a little straighter in their chairs. Lisa offered a small, composed smile, while Rachel smoothed her skirt. Brian crossed one leg over the other, eyes gleaming with pride. Susan gestured toward them. Lisa, perhaps you can share a few words on how your team creates that top-tier customer experience? Lisa stood, her tone polished. At Summit Air, we believe first-class service is more than a seat, it's a mindset. We recognize premium passengers by their expectations, their behavior, and the door opened. Every head turned. There, in the doorway, stood Emily Walker, dressed exactly as she had been the day before, gray sweatshirt, sweatpants, sneakers, and that familiar black cap. She carried herself with quiet grace, but her entrance stopped the room cold. Rachel's hand froze mid-adjustment. Brian blinked rapidly. Lisa went pale. David rose from his seat. "Apologies for the interruption," he said smoothly, though his tone carried unmistakable weight. "I believe some of you have already met my wife, Emily Walker." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room like a gust of wind slamming against the windows. Susan's face blanched. "Your wife?" David nodded. "Emily flew with Summit Air yesterday morning. First class. Denver to Boston." Lisa's posture faltered, the air seemingly draining from her lungs. "I was in seat 1A, Emily added, stepping forward. "Paid in full. I was asked, repeatedly, to prove I belonged. Not because of a problem with my ticket, but because of how I looked." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Let me be clear. I wasn't mistaken for a coach passenger. I was judged, by the staff you're honoring here today, because I didn't fit the image of what a first-class traveler is supposed to look like." Rachel looked down at the table. Brian's hands folded tightly in his lap. Lisa, still standing, struggled to speak. "It must have been a misunderstanding," she murmured weakly. Emily turned to her, voice calm but firm. "No. It was bias. And it wasn't subtle." David looked across the boardroom, locking eyes with the executives. "I'm not just here as a husband. I'm here as the owner of this airline. If this is how we define premium service, then we have a serious problem." The room fell completely silent. No one had expected the lesson on customer service to come from the customer herself. For a long moment, no one in the boardroom spoke. The air was thick with discomfort, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Emily Walker, standing in front of a dozen airline executives and department heads, remained composed. She looked around the room, not with anger, but with purpose. "What happened to me yesterday," she said slowly, "was not an isolated incident." She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a thin manila folder. Her fingers were steady as she placed it on the polished mahogany conference table. "This folder contains 27 documented cases from the last 3 months alone," she continued. "All involving paying passengers who were questioned, doubted, or redirected because they didn't look the part. David Walker, seated nearby, watched silently. His expression was unreadable, but his presence spoke volumes. He wasn't here as a CEO looking to control a PR crisis. He was here as a man supporting the truth. Emily went on. A teenage boy in a hoodie holding a business class ticket was pulled aside twice for additional verification. A disabled veteran, traveling with a valid priority boarding pass, was told to wait at the back of the line. An elderly woman in casual clothes was denied entry to the first-class lounge, despite holding a membership card she'd paid for annually since 1998. Murmurs stirred across the room. One board member cleared his throat, another shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "This isn't about bad apples," Emily said firmly. "This is about a system that quietly teaches frontline staff to trust appearance over evidence. A system that assumes money has a certain look, a certain sound, a certain wardrobe." She turned toward Lisa, Rachel, and Brian, who sat in stunned silence. "You asked for my ID," Emily said, addressing them directly, "because I didn't fit your expectations. You scanned my boarding pass 3 times and still assumed I didn't belong." Brian opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. "And I get it," Emily continued. "You weren't trying to be cruel. But that's what makes it worse. You didn't think twice. It was routine. Habitual. Normal." Susan Blake, the VP of Customer Experience, finally spoke. Her voice was shaky. "Mrs. Walker, I had no idea this was happening at this scale." "That's the problem," Emily replied gently. "You should have known." David stood. "From this day forward, we're making changes. Not just to policy, but to the culture. Every employee who interacts with passengers will undergo training to recognize implicit bias and learn how to treat every traveler with equal respect." He paused, letting the promise settle. "We'll also revise our complaint tracking system to flag patterns like these. No more brushing off bias as misunderstandings. If we want to call ourselves a premium airline, we have to deliver premium respect to everyone." Emily nodded, the burden in her chest finally beginning to lift. Change, she knew, wouldn't happen overnight. But today, it had finally begun. The weight of the silence in the conference room had shifted. What was once discomfort had become realization. Eyes once skeptical were now wide with unease. Emily Walker had not only exposed the problem, she had held up a mirror to a culture that many in the room had never bothered to question. David Walker, now standing at the head of the table, looked directly at the 3 flight attendants, Lisa Carter, Rachel Moore, and Brian Thompson. Their once proud expressions had faded to a pale mixture of regret and fear. "In many companies," David began, his voice calm but firm, "behavior like what took place on Flight 623 would result in immediate termination." The room tensed. Lisa looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. Rachel's eyes glistened. Brian sat frozen, as if bracing for the final blow. But David continued, "Firing you might feel satisfying in the short term. But it wouldn't fix what led to this." The statement caught everyone off guard. He glanced around the table. "This isn't about 3 individuals. This is about how we train, how we supervise, and how we model leadership from the top down. If we make this a story of 3 people losing their jobs, we ignore the real issue, and it'll happen again." Emily stepped beside him, her voice soft but resolute. "Real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from learning, from confronting hard truths, and being given a chance to do better." David nodded. "That's why, starting next week, we're implementing a company-wide anti-bias training program. Every employee, gate agents, flight attendants, customer service reps, will complete this training within 90 days. The HR director began scribbling notes furiously. Emily turned back to the flight crew. "As for the three of you," she said, "you're being reassigned, not fired. For the next month, you'll work in our passenger advocacy center, where real customer complaints are handled daily. After that, you'll serve 1 month on economy class flights, where empathy is essential and every inch of space is earned." The impact of her words hung in the air. Some executives nodded in agreement. Others looked quietly impressed. David finished, "If, after that, your performance reflects growth and understanding, you'll have the opportunity to reapply for first-class service." Susan Blake, still visibly shaken but now inspired, spoke up. "And I'll personally oversee the implementation of these reforms. Every documented case in that folder will be reviewed. Every voice will be heard." Emily smiled, not out of triumph, but out of hope. "This was never about me. It was about making sure the next young woman in sweatpants, or the older man in a worn jacket, doesn't have to prove they belong just to be treated with basic respect." The meeting didn't end with applause. It ended with resolve. And that, Emily knew, was the only kind of victory that mattered. 3 months later, Emily Walker boarded Summit Air Flight 427 from Denver to San Francisco, dressed in the same outfit that had caused such a stir not long ago: gray sweatshirt, light gray sweatpants, and her worn black cap. She carried the same leather backpack and wore the same silver bracelet that once belonged to her grandmother. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, something felt different. The atmosphere was warm, not tense. The crew greeted passengers not with guarded smiles, but with genuine welcome. There were no side glances, no hesitation. She took her seat, 1A, again, and pulled out her book, preparing for the 2.5-hour flight. Moments later, a familiar voice gently interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Walker," said Brian Thompson, the same flight attendant who had questioned her months earlier, "may I offer you a beverage before takeoff?" Emily looked up. Brian stood tall, his uniform crisp, his eyes kind, and this time, unmistakably respectful. "Just water for now," she replied with a small smile. As he placed the glass on her tray table, he paused. "I'm not sure if you remember me." "I do," Emily said, her tone neither sharp nor sarcastic. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "These past few months, working in passenger advocacy, then flying coach, it opened my eyes. I used to think I was fair. But I didn't realize how many small ways I was making people feel like they didn't belong." Emily nodded, letting him speak. "I saw it in their faces," he continued. "People who were overlooked, spoken to differently, doubted. Things I'd done without even thinking. It's been humbling." She looked at him thoughtfully. "That kind of awareness, it's not easy. But it's where real change begins." A few rows back, Rachel Moore helped an elderly man with his worn duffel bag, treating him with the same care she might have reserved for a VIP months ago. Across the galley, Lisa Carter was prepping drinks, her posture more relaxed, her expression open, not defensive, but grounded. Emily felt something she hadn't expected: pride. Not in herself, but in them. And it wasn't just this crew. Since the training began, Summit Air's customer satisfaction ratings had risen steadily. More importantly, reports of bias-related complaints had dropped significantly. Other airlines had taken notice. Summit's internal training program, once designed to address a painful incident, was now being shared across the industry. Her phone buzzed. A message from David. "How's the flight?" She smiled and typed back. "Better. Different, in the best way." As the aircraft lifted off the tarmac and climbed into the clouds, Emily looked around the cabin. Nearby, a young woman in ripped jeans laughed with her friend, sipping sparkling water in first class without a second glance from anyone. No awkward stares. No subtle judgment. Just people. Treated with dignity. For Emily, this was the real victory, not that she could fly without being questioned, but that others could too. Quietly, permanently, the culture had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Emily believed the skies were truly open for everyone. This story reminds us of a timeless truth: how we treat others reveals more about us than about them. In a world that often judges by appearance, titles, or wealth, Emily Walker's quiet strength serves as a powerful example. She chose not to retaliate with privilege, but to stand firm for fairness, not just for herself, but for everyone who's ever been overlooked or misjudged. For those of us with years of life experience, this is a call to reflect. Have we ever made assumptions too quickly? Have we ever been on the receiving end of one? The lesson here is clear: true dignity comes from recognizing it in others, regardless of their clothes, income, or status. And real change, whether in a company or a person, doesn't happen through punishment, but through reflection, education, and accountability. As we age, our influence grows, not in noise, but in wisdom. Whether we're still working or simply living with intention, we have the power to model kindness, to speak up when something's wrong, and to create spaces where every human being feels they belong. Because respect, in the end, is not a luxury, it's a birthright.